Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bridge the Gap, where you can learn all about how to get involved in research one episode at a time. My name's Alma.
Hi everyone, I am Sadia.
And in our few episodes, we actually told you all about what involvement is, why it matters, and how easily it is to get involved in research. Today we're going to talk about the different types of involvement and all the terms used to describe them and the people you have to consider. And to help us, we're joined by Stephanie Gillibrand, a fellow here at the University of Manchester.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi Steph.
So, hi Stephanie, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And for example, can you tell us what a fellow actually is?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Stephanie. I've been a researcher at the University of Manchester for 5 years now. So I started just before the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a really interesting time to start in health research. So I was a research associate for 2 years, and then I've been a research fellow for about 2.5 years. So a research fellow is like a early to mid-career researcher. Basically means that typically after you do your PhD, you'd get a research associate job or a research fellow job. But I've had a bit of a different background because I didn't actually do a PhD, or I've not actually done my PhD yet. I had a background in international development where I worked in like consultancy for a bit. So I kind of had a like different route into academia. And yeah, I got hired to work on a project that, you know, had that kind of wider stakeholder engagement. And when we talk about stakeholders, so external stakeholders or wider stakeholders, that could mean like basically any group or body that is not part of academia typically. So that could be people who make decisions about policy, people who make decisions about the health service, people who work in the NHS. It could be people in the third sector, so people who work for voluntary and charity organisations. It could be members of the public, local communities. So it's kind of an umbrella term that we use to describe like people that aren't us.
So like anybody except for the staff.
Well, I mean, staff could also be stakeholders as well. But it's kind of like an umbrella term that we use quite loosely to describe lots of other different players, if you like.
Oh, how interesting. And thank you so much for telling us about how you, like your journey into this, because as you said yourself, a lot of people have to go through like the rigid structure of like the PhD, etc. And it's really good for our viewers also to know that you can enter research in many different ways. So how would you describe involvement in your own words?
So I think involvement is kind of speaks more to that level of you might have someone involved in a meaningful way, as in they might be able to play a direct part in either research or decision making, or it might be a bit more like kind of consultation. So you're kind of just speaking to someone, getting their views, but there might not be other types of dynamics to that in terms of shared decision making.
Steph, who do we need to consider in involvement?
So I think this depends very much on the context of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and whether it's for research, whether it's for decision making, whether it's the kind of the nexus of those two things. And yeah, so I think the context is really important. Often, you know, more inclusive way of thinking about involvement would be, okay, well, why do we need to involve people? And that's, I think, the first thing that researchers certainly need to think about. Well, why is it important to involve people? Who then might that look like? But for example, you know, if you're doing some research around mental health services, obviously you might want to speak to people who would use those mental health services. You might want to speak to the staff who provide those mental health services. You might want to speak to commissioners. So commissioners are the people in the NHS who basically decide how money gets spent in the NHS. So how much that service gets allocated, you know, how it runs, that sort of thing. So that might be one example. You might also want to speak to the voluntary sector. So obviously there's loads of charities who specialise in mental health services. You know, they provide mental health services. They're like support networks. You might want to consider them as well. And also if it's a local, you know, service or it's a local research project, obviously you want to look at what's going on at a local level and thinking about that really broad encompassing range of all the different players. And I think that plays a large part of it is mapping who are all these people that we could speak to, and how might that fit in this like sphere of influence. And I think that's the point about involvement. It's about this sphere of influence and how people can influence.
Brilliant. And I was just wondering, I know in research we love to put like terms to everything, and I'm just going to add to that. I was wondering, do we have like any terms to describe like certain types of people?
So we typically tend to refer to like people who aren't specialized in a certain topic or a certain area as like lay people. Mm-hmm. And that is also a really relative term. Say, for example, if I might be an academic, I might be a researcher, I might be like specialized in a certain field, but if you were to put me in front of a medical doctor, I would definitely be a lay person. So, it's all relative and it's very context specific. But we'd also think about in terms of, the different types of people. Yeah, so we tend to talk about people with lived experience or experts by experience.
Are they two different terms, or are they used for the same person?
So my interpretation of this, emphasis on my interpretation, is that the term is used quite interchangeably. Mm-hmm. And I think the term using experts by experience in comparison to using person with lived experience is to the term using experts is to try and readdress that power imbalance. So as a researcher who works in an ivory tower institution, we have to be mindful of the fact that there are inherent power dynamics between like me as a researcher, the institution of the university, and members of the public, local communities, anyone who's not part of that institution in an informal or formal way. And so what that means is that when we are trying to work together in a partnership way, where we're trying to, think about proper collaboration and partnership working and sharing of those power dynamics, we need to think about language. And language is really, really important. What we call ourselves, what we call other people, the labels we attach to things. So using the term experts by experience tries to put a bit of, it tries to address the power imbalances between someone who has formal, in quotation marks, academic qualifications that says that they are an authority to speak on this topic. So by using the term experts by experience, it gives them that same authority within that label to speak on that topic. And so it's trying to address some of those power imbalances.
What are the actual different types of involvement?
That's an excellent question.
Very big question.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So I work as part of a team called Reval, who do rapid kind of research evaluations tends to be of like different NHS kind of services. And so we're really responsive to kind of what does the NHS want to know about either this service or this program, which means that our kind of research topic is already quite largely defined, not by us. And that means that typically we don't have that power to do the agenda setting part, which is sometimes called co-production or co-design. Right. And that might be when you are like designing the research question from scratch, with a community or with members of the patients and public to decide, how should that research be shaped, what it should look like. I've been involved in some other projects where, the COVID vaccine equity project, where we had a piece of research that was doing some statistical analysis on COVID vaccine uptake. But we thought it was really important to do some additional research to find out, well, why might there be variation in vaccine uptake? And that was a point that was raised by our advisory group. It was, members of local communities who'd kind of said, well, it's just really important that we do an additional research project that looks at some of the drivers behind that in more detail. So really, it was their idea to do that research project. And so we, worked with them to think about, okay, well, what should that research look like? And we also spoke to stakeholders, so people in the NHS at the local level who were involved in the vaccine rollout, to think about what was important to them. So we could have that really kind of lots of involvement and engagement around how that research should be shaped and what should we look at. So those are kind of some of the different contexts around the starting point of research, and then how that affects how you might then be able to do public patient involvement.
So we do hear these words a lot, like you've mentioned, like co-production and co-design and all these co-words. But would you mind just briefly describing and explaining what it is,
Okay.
the big C's?
So I'm going to start with consultation.
Great.
This is because thinking about the spectrum. So consultation, I would say, is you're consulting with members of the public. So you're not necessarily sharing decision making.
Mm.
You know, you're going to them to get their views, but there's not that kind of same expectation that then might have the same impact and influence on, you know, decisions either around the research design or how the research is conducted, things like that. So, and consultation, there's often, you know, debates in the kind of public engagement world around, you know, issues of like rubber stamping and tick boxing. And this is kind of some of the politics. Are we just doing it a tick box because now research funders say, by and large, you really have to do it?
Okay.
But again, that means that might be context specific and there might be a reason people are doing consultation. It also doesn't mean that it's like a binary and a singular research project may only do consultation or may only do more meaningful involvement. So it's not static as well. And I think and different parts of the research life cycle, you know, different parts of that project might have different parts of involvement and engagement. Collaboration would be more of a meaningful long-term partnership. And, you know, when we think about partnership, we think about relationship building, we think about trust, that kind of power sharing and that ability to make shared decisions and have uncomfortable conversations as well. I think this is a part that we maybe don't talk about as much is, you know, sometimes it's not straightforward. Sometimes it's really hard to build consensus and to find consensus, particularly when we're doing quite sensitive research. So, you know, these are really important things that we need to think about. I think collaboration really needs to emphasize that kind of shared partnership way of working.
So more like a give and take. So instead of me just saying things to you and you like doing what you need with it, it's almost like we're having a back and forth conversation of I suggest this and you're like, yeah, that might be, let's see if that fits in somewhere.
Yeah, I think that would probably be moving even further towards like co-production. So we could talk about co-production, which is, I mean, you know, I suppose in its most informal sense is the shared production of, you know, whether that's the research, whether that's the research design. I mean, there are like some quite accepted principles of co-production, and that is power sharing. So reciprocity, which is what you just mentioned. So that kind of, you know, that give and take, and also like boosting, you know, maybe the skills or the interests or the kind of development of people who are involved. You know, not just the researchers. It's about inclusion. So involving and including, you know, different perspectives, and that kind of plays into consensus building as well. And also like respecting and valuing, you know, partnerships as well. And yeah, really that's all kind of underpinned on building trust and relationships.
It kind of sounds like collaboration and co-production are quite similar. Is there like any distinctive differences or are they kind of the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And I think this kind of goes back to the point about that it is at a spectrum. Also, like, I am not a singular authority on this, and there is like really ongoing debate and, you know, really wildly different used definitions around, you know, these terms, and they can often be applied in different ways. So I think that's really important to think about. But I think the co-production distinction is emphasizing, you know, what is actually delivered at the end and how has that been shaped in a way that is produced together.
Right.
I just think it's really interesting trying to look at things in terms of, instead of these like strict definitions, looking at it more in terms of how involved do I want to get into these research projects. And I think, say, if there's a research project and I only want to do a little bit, maybe it's my first research project, I'm quite nervous. Do you think it's fine maybe to start consultation, or do we need to strive straight away to go to like co-production or co-design?
That's such a good question, because I think the way that the kind of ethos of public engagement, that kind of whole debate and fora is moving at the moment is much more towards, co-production and really kind of pushing, a lot of that. However, I think we do need to be mindful about what people want, and obviously we need to have those opportunities if that's how people want to be involved, but that might not always be appropriate. And really it needs to be led by, the people who are involved themselves. I think, it's important that people know that spectrum, know exactly how they can get involved, know that they can have that sphere of influence if they want, know that they can share in these decision-making if they want, but also that, if it's your first time getting involved in something, you might just want to actually get a sense about what's it all about, what's it like to work with this team, because, if you don't like working with that team, you might not want to get too involved. And I think, it's about giving that autonomy and choice to people. Like, that's really the ethos of all of this. So, I think that's probably the most important thing. And I mean, what we like to try and do in our work is kind of give a bit of a menu of options. Like this is the research. These are the different ways that you might be able to get involved. Does that sound like something you're interested in? Are there any skills that you want to learn? Or is there any kind of ways of doing research that you're interested in? Are you interested in creative methods? And try and work with, the people that we're involving and engaging with, to have that kind of conversation and also make it fluid and dynamic as well. So as I said earlier, you might get involved and think, I just want to be a bit light touch in this because, I'm doing my masters or I'm doing exams, I've not got time to get really fully involved, and that's fine. And then, you might have more time and you want to get more involved. So it should be that kind of fluid and kind of ongoing conversation that people can change.
Some of the things that I hear are terms like co-researcher, co-applicant, and principal investigator. I was wondering if maybe you could kind of clear up the air on some of those for us.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, really good question. So the terms around principal investigator and co-applicant come from when we are applying for grants. So to kind of do research, we typically have to apply for research funding.
Right.
And so we have these big research funders like the National Institute for Health Research. And we as researchers get a team together and apply for funding to be able to take forward research ideas. So the principal investigator would be the lead of that, like the lead of that team, the lead of that project. Typically it's a professor, but it could also be a professor and an early or mid-career researcher like myself. So then you'd have a co-principal investigator and another co-principal investigator. So you'd have kind of two tag teaming it, kind of mentorship relationship. And co-applicants is a kind of, again, a bit of a broad umbrella term for everyone else who would be included on that grant application. And typically that's about showcasing the different skills. And so more and more there is a push from research funders to include people with lived experience, public contributors, to be involved in these grant applications because, they're increasingly recognising the importance of that. And another way that people can be involved is also through co-researchers. So this might be where, for example, you had someone with lived experience of either a health condition or of a particular service. And, we want to be able to enable people to take part on an equal playing field with researchers. So the idea of a co-researcher is that we can train people and upskill people to do what we do, which is, conduct research.
And just one last question, Steph, so we don't bombard you for the rest of the day. I'm just interested in why should young people know about all these different types of involvement?
So I think, when we think about research, it's funded by public money. If we think about like the democracy around research, that people should be able to have a say in what that research looks like because it's for everyone, it's paid for by everyone, and it's important that reflects the needs and priorities of not only the people who might be affected by the research findings, but also by the people who might want to determine and shape how that research looks like in the first place.
The public should be getting involved, it is their money and it's also in their best interest. And now that our young people have listened to this episode, they really are going to understand that varying depth of involvement and the different types and how they all require maybe like a different a set of knowledge and skills, but they're also very different opportunities. And it's all about kind of their capacity and how they want to feed into this. And that, you know, there's different levels of commitment as well. And so there's something for everyone in all these different types.
If there's one thing that you want our listeners to take from what we've discussed today, what would that be?
Just get involved and don't be shy.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to ask questions as well. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, you can request beanbags. So we had a session with Steph and we were in a room with beanbags and it was the best session ever. So make sure you request beanbags for creativity.
Available on request.
So thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us on this episode. The next episode will look at the concept of lived experience in more detail with another guest. So as always, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for joining us on Bridge the Gap. Don't forget to follow or subscribe and check out our socials.